Colleagues, can I ask you, I hate to, break up a good conversation, but we've got people online who've been very patient, and obviously you. So please take a seat. Okay. You can sit wherever. Gosh, perhaps it's a setting, this kind of church setting, you've suddenly become really quiet and in prayer. Thank you very much for that. A warm welcome again, as I said, Dharmendra Kanani, but in my different role here is to moderate a session on a renewed social contract. We've brought together, as I said to you earlier, we've got different perspectives here around this table, but we've also online. And so essentially what we want to do is, what are the kind of approaches we need to be taking, or things that we need to be thinking about, or we can draw upon for moving towards a renewed social contract, or transforming? What are the transformative practices we need that will just kick us down a bit more than we are facing at the moment? Unfortunately, what the world and life teaches us is that adversity, there's nothing like adversity to make us think differently or change. But I suppose, how do we turn that emotional reaction, that sense of, not putting things down, but actually we needed to be jolted into reality, into a positive, and how can we act on it in terms of policy terms, if it's ever possible? I don't know. But, surely, we don't have to get to the point where things are so bad that we have no alternative but to do the right thing. And so we want to change that momentum, if you like. What I'd like to do firstly is welcome Najma, who's online.
Hello.
Hello, Najma. Good to see you. You may not remember me or recognize me, Dharmendra, from Friends of Europe. You're all because Najma is a member of our Women's Leadership Network that we set as a part of our Africa-Europe Foundation. Really good to have you join us. So, Najma, the whole thing is running out of time, right? Physically here, but I think we're also running out of time globally in terms of the things that we need to do and tackle in terms of climate crisis. Can you just set out some of your thinking that, the work you've been doing with Patrick here in terms of the eco-social contract and some of the essentials, if you like. If you could cut to the heart of what are the essentials that we need to be thinking about. Because, and I say this to all of us and to our colleagues, we're all very good at deconstructing the problem. We can do it till the cows come home. We can say, oh my God, this has gone wrong. We're really poor at building solutions. So let's be thinking about what we should be doing, and what are the key actions that we should be focusing. So Najma, on that very challenging basis, over to you.
Thank you, Dharmendra, and I absolutely do remember you. It's wonderful to connect again, and it's been really inspiring being part of, watching the sort of live sessions online and just taking inspiration from the really cases where we're trying to restore trust, trying to build, greater accountability mechanisms and really give a space for people's voices to become part of the decisions that impact their lives. But I think marginal to a lot of the discussions that we've been having around this new social contract has actually been a voice we sometimes lose, in the noise of all the challenges, the poly crisis that's hitting us from several directions, and that is the voice of nature. And so restoring that relationship between people and nature has actually been excluded from many of the discussions and the theories around the new social contract, but it actually is at the heart of the ecological and climate breakdown that we're facing, is the breakdown in that relationship. And we see it, and I'm going to skip through some of these facts and figures. We see the outcome of this broken relationship in the fact that even though we depend fundamentally upon nature for our survival, we're bankrolling, we're paying for the destruction of nature to the tune of almost 2 trillion annually. We see it in the social and environmental cost of over-extraction, pollution, and exploitation that's being borne by the most vulnerable and marginalized countries and societies and communities. And so we definitely, as many have said, are looking at a crisis has got, two sides, a social and an ecological side. But I want to tell you a story, how opportunity can come out of crisis. So in 2018, my hometown of Cape Town, South Africa, made the headlines really globally as we were facing this day zero, basically a day when the city would run out of water completely. Water for domestic use, water for businesses, completely, an actual countdown on the clock. And 4.6 million people live in Cape Town and need water for domestic use and for businesses. And 4.6 million people actually rallied together, to find the solutions, from business to government, faith leaders, community leaders, actually started to use water and think about people's relationship with water differently. But it was this multitude of messaging and languages, from, water as part of a production and manufacturing system, to water as a human right, water as life-giving, water as sacred. And out of that crisis actually came a reconfiguration of that relationship that people have with nature up to today. When I visit and spend time with family in Cape Town, South Africa, I'm still, given the list of do's and don'ts around water, but people's relationship is fundamentally changed around nature. I do think it's worth thinking very shortly about why this disconnect happened. And I do think we've probably seen dominant views of human mastery and control over nature really shape the design of our economies. The models and pathways that have brought us to the brink of climate and ecological breakdown are actually shaped by three beliefs. First, one, that human beings are superior to nature. Second, this blind belief that infinite growth is going to deliver prosperity for all, and which we know it won't. And the third, in this paradigm, people are regarded primarily as consumers. And so we focus, on individualism, self-interest, materialism, and really the short-term thinking that's wired into into the way we think about our economies. So nature within this worldview is actually seen as largely its utility and benefit to humankind, and environmental damage is negative externalities that we price out of our economic models very often. That's beginning to change. But we also get to the point where nobody really wants to pay for this climate and environmental catastrophe that we've created. And many of us who were at COP, felt the significance of the moral victory of a loss and damage fund being established, but it's a fund that's empty, essentially. No money, committed to commensurate with that responsibility. So how can we actually build, a new eco-social contract to repair this relationship with nature and shift us from a sort of a ego-centered to an eco-centered social contract? And how can we move from this idea of people as only consumers to people as citizens, people as living in community with life on this planet? And how can we begin to see ourselves as interdependent, part of this interdependent ecosystem, and work for the prosperity of all life within the planetary limits that we're beginning to understand more and more. Three areas that we can work on. I think we need to focus on the sort of, I've heard it in a few places, that sort of moral compass, but just re-understanding, reimagining, our solidarity and togetherness with all life. And we're beginning to hear that voice from many parts of society, thinking about not only human well-being, because more and more we're understanding, the need for well-being and prosperity, but also planetary well-being. And then a term I've heard in multiple conversations about the restoration of respect and understanding. And that's really important when we start thinking about our relationship with nature. And this requires really a fundamental reassessment of the purpose and the goal and the vision of our economies. And the good news is that we're beginning to see this happening. We're beginning to see it in new economic models that pushing us to think beyond measuring financial outcomes and how much we spend, beyond the sort of GDP thinking to measures around prosperity, dignity, happiness, the well-being of all life, the health of our biological systems. So we really need a new vision, but also new ways that we govern and measure economic, prosperity. Bearing in mind that we are part of, one of many life forms that inhabit this planet. The second area is I do think we need much stronger application of rights of nature vision, but we need to also, understand it. We're beginning to see it in some of the really progressive constitutional reform processes. But as we've heard from the Chilean case study, people have to understand, what does it mean when we want to, protect and enshrine rights of nature in our constitution? What does it mean for people? We're beginning to see it in litigation. I think it was mentioned very early this morning when we started up that we're beginning to see the rights of rivers and ecosystems and landscapes being protected in our courts. And we're actually beginning to see it in the way that we manage natural resources. Many natural resource systems are not only beginning to think of how much water or how much of a landscape do we need, for people to live, prosperous lives, for jobs and livelihoods to continue. But what is the ecological ceiling for nature to continue surviving, for nature to continue, within its own right to have, functioning ecological systems where all life, not only human life, prospers? So we're beginning to see the really innovative ways of managing our relationship with nature. And then last area that I really want to put forward is we're beginning to see nature becoming part of the civic mobilization. I think it was wonderful to start up this roundtable with the voices of new and future generations and young people that are working on this issue. And I think the same momentum that we're generating around this sort of climate emergency, we need to bring that momentum around, the ecological emergency. In the UK at the moment, there's a fantastic process around a people's plan for nature happening in towns and cities all over, and people are beginning to reconnect and understand their relationship with nature. I think just probably in conclusion to open up and really to find the space for conversation in today's fantastic deliberations was really, I think we've got knowledges, wisdoms and understandings to actually help us reframe our relationship with nature. And I think that relationship needs to be reframed if we're thinking about a new social contract and a new, economic pathway to take us into a more, prosperous future. Scientists have been speaking about this for decades. Those of us who are working in this field are probably living with climate and ecological anxiety for decades as the message gets bigger and stronger and more urgent. We've got traditions and wisdoms across the world. The voices that are really hearing, the cries of nature and understanding how deeply the same sort of violent system of exploitation that we've unleashed against, exploiting people and vulnerable and marginalized people over the world, we've unleashed as a society upon nature, and it's come back, to meet us now with the kind of challenges we're facing. But we've got traditions and wisdoms and people that understand this language of nature and that can tell us where we're going wrong and what we've got to change to go forward. And so I think we're at a point where we can't ignore these voices anymore. We're hearing it from scientists, from our politicians, cultures, religious leaders, and the legal world actually urging us to change course. And I think these voices are getting louder. I don't think we can, ignore it anymore. And we're beginning to realize that, without, flourishing nature, we can't survive. Our businesses cannot, continue. Our societies and towns and farms and factories, cannot continue in the way that we needed to actually meet, many basic human needs in many parts of the world. So I think, at the heart of this eco-social contract is this idea of what do we owe one another, what do we expect from our leaders when they get into positions of power, where we expect them, to make the kind of decisions that fit for the challenges that we face. But I think it's also time that we need to ask, what do we owe nature as we think about this new world that we want to reimagine and we're already seeing people are working to create.
Great.
So thank you, Dharmendra. That's some opening thoughts.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Najma. And I think what occurs to me from what you said is that we have to think about those people who are not in this space, right? How do we, given we have so many issues around education, the fact is, increasingly, children that go through primary, secondary education have no relationship to nature. It's been almost removed. And I think increasingly, if we want to really affect the mindset of future generations, how does education change to make education feel as if, because that's where inculcation happens, that's where we get our conditioning. And at the moment, I think with budgets and the way education is structured, and the culture of it, there is what you're talking about, no sense of it, unless you've got an enlightened head teacher or a primary teacher that will actually say, kids, come on, let's go engage with the forest or the garden or whatever. It's urban. And the second thing is this, the most corrosive but potentially positive thing is something that we need to work with in terms of your message. Because how does digitalization, metaverse, help us think about nature differently? And I suppose lastly is the point of, when you're thinking about this group being beamed out to, let's say, supporters in the UK of Boris, and supporters in the United States who supported Trump, people in some of the African states that supported some of the most right-wing, corrupt leaders, that community is not going to get this conversation. They're just not going to get this conversation. At the moment, we are seeing what's happening in terms of how certain religious communities are manipulating the vote in America, in Eastern Europe. Look what's happening in Poland and Hungary. Religion and, imagine the question about women's rights in terms of reproduction is being raised in the 21st century. I mean, go figure. How is nature going to fashion in that? So I think we need to kind of perhaps rethink or recalibrate. How do you weave this conversation, which feels so removed from the everyday realities of a crisis of livelihoods agenda, and make it real? So just those thoughts that kind of occurred to me, perhaps hopefully generate conversation. I'm going to move swiftly, but thank you very much, Najma, and obviously we'll come back to you. I'm going to swiftly move on to OECD. OECD, obviously, as you know, an association of countries, very powerful in terms of being able to influence and, I suppose, shape policy and thinking amongst leaders in their member states, in their membership. It's really good to have Romina. Romina, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. You've been doing a lot on this agenda. I mean, you wouldn't call it social contract, but all the elements of the work you've been dealing with are fundamentally about it, whether it's sustainability, whether it's about looking at GDP, beyond GDP, etc. Can you give us your take on this agenda? Is the notion of a renewed social contract having traction in the policy community, or is it simply seen as being a bit of fluff?
Well, thanks for the great question. I think this is something that is getting more and more mature and concrete, and I wanted actually to answer this question by, in fact, relating closely to what you were saying, Joshua, about the need to actually reconnect policies with people and what people want to understand. And that was actually really the starting point of the work that we did in the OECD when we look at measures beyond GDP. And one of the problems of GDP and these economic indicators is that essentially they don't mean very much for normal people. And so they are not only, from a very, very strictly statistical perspective, sort of incorrect and imperfect, they also unfortunately carry little significance, I think, to what really matters to people. So that's where we decided, to generate work that would allow us essentially to map precisely what matters to people, what are the outcomes that are important in their lives. And the idea was not only to look at progress, the social progress that countries were making on those outcomes, but actually, very importantly, understand how public policy should be focused on those well-being concerns. So that's really sort of the big agenda that we developed at that in that context, and when we started working on that. But importantly, as we were working on that agenda, we saw big trends characterizing all OECD countries, and obviously not just OECD countries, related to the increase of inequalities. And I think the increase of the feelings and perceptions that people were having about limited opportunities, definitely very unequal opportunities. And that, I think, speaks fundamentally to the challenge of the social contract, because when you do have a system that is not delivering to people, and certainly is not delivering in equal terms, or is only benefiting to a few, essentially you are challenging quite, again, fundamentally, structurally, the notion of social contract. So as I said, the point is not just, objectively speaking, so if you just look at the statistics on inequalities, you see this is growing in OECD countries. This was already the case before the pandemic, but of course we all know that the pandemic has only reinforced and exacerbated inequalities. The problem is that people are getting worried and worried, right? And so if you ask them in terms of what they expect for the future, in fact, they will say a very large majority, 65% in OECD countries, will tell you that they think that they, in their own life, will have much lower chances to do well than their parents, and for their children, it will be even worse. When you ask questions about what they think determines success in life, what really matters to sort of be economically successful, people say that most of the drivers are about things that they can't control, things such as gender, race, or the income and education of the parents. So that means that in terms of expectations, and therefore also possible, hope, but also the willingness perhaps of people to support the social contract, we really need to override a change, because those people obviously really don't support the social contract as it is working today. That's why we need to be transformative, as you were saying. And so in terms of concrete solutions, let me perhaps just highlight some of the findings from the work we did, and that was really in the context of the COVID, but I think this is about policy insight that would work still in the current context. And this is about finding solutions that work well for people and the planet at the same time. And they work precisely, I think, to give equal opportunities, and also to make sure that, again, the disadvantage doesn't compound, across areas of life, but also across generations. So we really insist on the importance of providing high quality, sustainable jobs to all. We very much insist on the importance of putting in place strong upskilling and lifelong learning systems, in particular, with good tailoring and outreach to the most disadvantaged people and communities. We talk a lot right now about mental health programs, and because, of course, we saw with the pandemic that mental health became a big issue in OECD countries. And in general, we're talking about well-integrated child well-being policies. So recognizing that reducing child poverty and improving child well-being is something that really takes sort of all of the government approach. And so these are sort of some basic ideas. But if I have still a couple of minutes, I also wanted to talk about, in particular, the issues of the equal social contract, because clearly the green transition is coming up, with a number of challenges. And we've done some analysis at the OECD that looks at essentially the cost of inaction on climate change, but also cost of action of climate change. And so what we have found is that this cost, so both cost of action and inaction, are very much concentrated. These are not distributed evenly across the population. So in particular, let me be a little bit more precise. So, well, I'm talking about cost of inaction. I'm talking, if nobody does anything to fight climate change, this is going to be very, very detrimental for some very specific groups in the population, namely the very young people, the elderly, but also, some workers, of course, that work in particularly sort of polluted economies and activities. We also know, of course, that, it is households that work in cities, in the urban areas, as opposed to the one that work in and live in the countryside, that are more sort of concerned and impacted by pollution. So we know very well, again, that the effects are not linear, and the effects are not going to be the same for the different type of households and workers. And similarly, we know that when governments step in and try, of course, to do the right things to do for fighting climate change, sometimes the effects of the policies, again, can be very uneven and very unjust. So typically, we know that if you put the price on carbon and, you tax, emission, this can be very regressive for the most vulnerable households. Or if, for instance, you have to obviously completely transform the economy, you have to change, the structure of production. And we know that this is going to be particularly bad for some categories of industries and workers, some communities, some geographies. So again, this is not something that is going to be even across the board. So the main point of this report on the nexus between inequalities and environment that we published last year is about making sure that policies consider, from the very sort of onset, so from the very moment of design, the compensation of this uneven cost. And so that is quite important for us, because otherwise, the policies are not going to be understood, they're not going to be acceptable by the communities, and therefore they're not going to work. So there is a final point I wanted to make. And this is, when we talk about a social contract, we're obviously very much focusing on the notion of reciprocity. And so it's interesting when you ask the people about, what they think about climate change. The large majority in the OECD countries for which we have evidence will say climate change is a really important problem. We should do things about it, and our governments, should actually, put action on this. However, it's also interesting to see that sometimes there are contradictions. So, if you ask to the consumers and citizens if they're ready actually also to obviously take action and change, behaviors, some of them do not seem to be so well intentioned. And so typically, I think there are still a lot of reluctance when it comes to limiting the use of cars, but also, for instance, to limit reduce the consumption of meat. And so there are a number of behaviors for which we know that OECD populations are not necessarily in a very, very cooperative move at the moment. And so the question is, I think, from a public policy perspective, is how do you actually also incentivize the people to change those behaviors, but also how you enable that change, right? And so a very final example I want to make in this respect is public transport and public infrastructure. So if you want that people stop using the car, you obviously need to build a strong green infrastructure system in a country to ensure that public transport is accessible and affordable. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Romina. I'm struck by this, what you just said on that last point, because there's many people of let's say, I'm probably the oldest one in the room, but that kind of, my generation and those just below, who would say, actually we should cut out flights now. People should be flying, and we should be going by train, and we should really kind of reduce airplanes and air use. And you say to yourself that suddenly in the past 50 years you've seen some of the poorest communities in the world being able to fly for the first time, and we say no. Don't go there. You don't need to go to Hawaii. I've been there 15 times. I'm 50 now, but actually you don't go to Hawaii. You have to think about the climate. And it's that trick that we can't pull off. We have to get a different narrative, right? And I think in Europe, we had this last December, we had one of our European young leaders who did a brilliant presentation on rail travel in Europe. So he's basically been blogging every day, every week for months, and literally going from north, south, east, west of Europe on rail. And every time he would stop and see there's a railway track that just stops at a border, and there's nothing you can do to get to the other side, apart from get off the train and go and pack and then go on another train. And, he spoke about the cost, the lack of infrastructure. And you think, actually, and it's your point, Romina, one massive, let's say iconic moonshot project from the European Commission or the Union or the Parliament might be actually, we're going to invest 5 billion on, rail infrastructure and make it cheaper, faster and better and more connected. But again, they won't do that because of what? Subsidiarity and sovereignty of individuals. And this is what we need to, I think that's why I raised the point with you, Romina, is that how much traction is there amongst those that you communicate in the civil service of governments that get this agenda? And I think that the point that you made about the fact that when we look at housing, who lives in the poorest housing in Europe? It's people with the lowest income and the people who are going to likely to have the highest impact of climate change, because weather storms will hit and knock down those because they're cheap concrete high rises. And we haven't given a thought to that. But on that cheery note, let's move on to, thank you, we'll come back to you. Let's talk about investment. I want to bring in Hans. Hans, thank you for being with us. Troodos Bank, Money Matters. You come from a very different breed of bank, if you like, a new, more social, purposeful bank. Give us your take on this conversation and the kinds of incentives that are likely to work.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I've been around here all day, and what struck me most, to be honest, is that when talking about the social contract, in all of those presentations, nobody mentions the financial system. While, on the other hand, people say, yeah, it's a different kind of economic structure or whatever. And when they talk about the economic structure or the economic system, it's about what I call the real economic system. But above that, like I also told this morning, is the big financial system, which in the end drives part of the real economy. And I totally missed that. So why is the social contract not about our contract with the financial system? And to give a few examples, normally I talk about a lot about our tendency that we think, or our eternal growth, our infinite growth idea. And but then we still talk about the real economy, the relation with real economic activity, with planetary boundaries, etc. But in the financial sector itself, it's more detrimental, because we expect with every investment that it gives a certain return, and on a macroeconomic level, the return is economic growth, nominal economic growth. And if we have the highest debt ever at this moment, and debt is nothing else than a claim on future productivity, so on future economic activity, a claim on future detrimental activity, we should discuss that. And then I was thinking, I can say a lot about what would work, but I think that already a lot have been said. But I think we can learn from history a few things about when it goes wrong with the financial system and what you can do. So my proposal, I just thought of it just now, would be to set a cap to interest rates, because that would be a cap to growth, to expected growth, I have to say. That's as technocratic as the financial system, so we also don't have to discuss it here. Makes your life also much easier. So let's say 2-3% long term. I think that would work. Then the second one is to get a debt jubilee, so no claim on future productivity. A lot of redistribution would also work quite well, not for the 1%, but in terms of redistribution, it works quite well. Also very technocratic, yeah, it will be politically infeasible probably, but in terms of idea, I think it is easier than the other solutions we can discuss, from carbon pricing, all kinds of taxes, all other stuff, which is really political, a lot of redistributional effects. So my solution would be partly to solve it within the financial system. That's for now.
Wonderful, now we're cooking. There you go. I'm glad you just made it off the top of your head, because that's the best ideas.
Yeah, I have all day to think about it.
Exactly. No, but good. There you go. I hope someone's recording this, because that's a really good idea. We will take it forward most definitely, because I think let's think about it. We'll bring you on board, because one of the things that's missing out of this debate, and I'm glad you raised the issue of money. 2 points. One, during COVID, and it's a point you were making, Romina, is that how do you get people to become active more so, rather than passive observers of their lives, feeling they have no control, when taxpayers' money, so your money, our tax, underpinned the whole of global society for over a year and a half. The ordinary taxpayers' money through government was keeping people paid in the private sector, SMEs, and buoying up the economy. Now that's the biggest payback of the social contract from people's individual taxes, but people didn't see that. So many of people, I've got a lot of people who are, coming from an immigrant refugee background, a lot of folk with not a lot of education, but have no clue about actually the fact that my tax should have a social return is missing out of that dialogue. And that's how you change the dynamic of passive observation, Romina, I hope, that we need to think about that if hundreds and billions of taxpayers' money has been spent, how do you create that sense of soul and energy within people to say, I need a bit of accountability on this. I need a bit of payback in a social way. And I think that's missing. The other thing is, I was in a conversation with some consultancies, and there was advising people in the Commission. And they said, the Commission will not, Europe will not grow economically because its social welfare model is too highly costly and uncompetitive. So they are saying, give up on some of the social welfare net, cut out some of the red tape, make yourself more economically competitive, and it will be good for everybody else. Classic economic theory. And I think what we need to change is that mindset. Is how do you do that? So, we need more socially minded economists. So put a call out. Those of you who are watching and those of you in this room, find top-rated economists that get this agenda, who are able to say that we can give you an economic model that the social contract pays back, makes us inclusive in terms of our economic growth, and actually tackle climate change. So that's a challenge, and that's a call out there. Any of you economists out there that are prepared to pull together a paper that goes against the grain of the 5 top agencies in the world, Accenture, PwC, all of that, who say to leaders, it's another way. We need to find top-grade economists that actually say there's another way of doing it. So thank you for that. But on that note, I'm going to move to yourself. In terms of, you did something remarkable in that you can tell us where the kind of motivation came from, but Royal Dutch Shell Company, you actually took them to court and won. Tell us a bit about that in terms of, that's about civic action on a different level. Now, you might have a middle-class background, quite well heeled. How do we motivate others to do the kind of things that you do? Over to you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Maybe starting with a positive
Sorry,
anecdote.
I should say Donald Pauls. I didn't introduce your name.
I'm Donald Pauls, Director of Milieudefensie, Friends of the Earth Netherlands. This morning, before I left to come here, I had a quick conversation with my son of 9 years, and he told me, Dad, I have the sense that you are having impact with your job. You're doing your job well. And I said, okay, yes, why are you saying? And he said, yeah, I have the sense that it's getting a bit colder. So I was thinking, this dilemma. Should I continue and be proud of my son or should I tell him about the difference between climate and weather? But the thing is, of course, why I'm mentioning this is that 9-year-old kids are thinking about climate change. So all of the old people running this country and running the world, thinking that they are in the situation that this will just go away. It will not go away. The wave of public support and public pressure to take action on climate change will only be increasing. And then to your question on Shell and in the relation to the social contract, I believe that a crucial part for managing the challenges of global public goods like climate change, biodiversity, inequality, can only be addressed if we address the position of multinationals. Multinationals are, and it's interesting to have this discussion here because, the first multinational in the world was founded in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, the East India Company. It has been one of the most creative human institutions in the world, but also one of the most destructive human institutions in the world. It's not for nothing that New York, New Amsterdam, New Zealand, the world over, places are named in reference to Dutch people and companies. So that's the creative side, but it's also intimately related to colonization, slavery, destruction of nature, of communities, and the globe in essence. And to give an example, of course, is Shell, that emits, if you compare the emissions of Shell to that of a country, Shell would be the 5th largest polluter in the world after China, US, Russia, India, and then Shell. And multinationals are not regulated. So they are some of the biggest polluters in the world, but they are not part of any regulation because our regulation is nationally oriented. We have national legal frameworks. And luckily, you could say, there's a change in society. You see the trust in multinationals are declining substantively. In the Netherlands now, trust is at an all-time low. It's never been as low as this at this stage. And that's not strange, because multinationals has always been an extractive institute, extracting value from society and redistributing value from society to the 1%. And people are now slowly seeing that. So the trust is low. People see that the CO2 of multinational companies are only increasing. Since 1992, when the first international agreement on climate change has been signed, the emissions from companies has increased in the Netherlands and globally. But also the share of income going towards multinational companies have also increased to the detriment of the rest of society. And people feel that that is fundamentally unequal, unjust, but it's also hurting them. So in my view, we should find a way to include multinationals in a new social contract. And we have one opportunity now. But because after climate change, they need our support to make the transition. They now also see the need to go to a low-carbon economy, and they understand, like we all do, that we have 7-8 years to achieve that change. And even these enormous institutions can only do it if we as a society support them. So now is the opportunity to say, you need us. Now we need to change this relationship between multinationals and society. You can get our support. That is the social contract. You can get our support. We will invest in you. We will give you subsidies. We will provide the infrastructure. But only on one condition, democratically regulated framework. That will consist at least of 3 elements. The first is that every company should accept that they also need to implement international climate agreements. Just like all of us. They're not outside of the debate, they're part of the legal framework like we all are. So they need to implement the 1.5 degree policy and practice. The second is that they can only receive public support in the form of subsidies if they do not shift their profits to their shareholders. Because it's, of course, it's the weirdest thing in the world that most companies expect society to provide them with subsidies while they're giving profit to their shareholders. You know, either you don't have money to invest in the transition, and then you also don't transfer funds to your shareholders, or you say, we come to society and we provide you. So that's the second. You can only get subsidies if you do not pay dividends to your shareholders. And the last point would be that they accept a global framework, a due diligence framework, in which they accept that they will have due diligence for their activities outside of Europe, in the case of the Netherlands, outside of the Netherlands, that it will not, that they will not act to the detriment of the environment, nature, and communities outside of the Netherlands. So those elements, that I would say that is a basic social contract.
Very specific, very clear. Thank you very much. And let's see again, let's document these and then give them a bit more life and breath in a conversation over the next coming months.
And maybe just one last remark. If you don't do that, best multinational companies, Milieudefensie is waiting for you.
No, it's very, very good, because it's almost like a manifesto or a charter for leaders of multinationals that should do the right thing. But the worm, I suppose for me, how can you make sure this is not elective? And it feels like you need to find systems that are create the worm in the system that actually affects behavior. So, for example, we know GDPR, that if you don't, as a multinational leader, do the right thing, you've got a massive £1 million fine or you're in jail. And I'm not suggesting the same thing, but actually, how do we affect the systems of audit and governance checking? So I think the international audit game needs to change. That doesn't just talk about money and widgets, that talks about this agenda. And I also think that the governance frameworks that we have in place need to be amended to think about this agenda rather than simply, lack of confidence or, looking at things that are marginal to how we can change things and looking at, if a friend of a friend has got some money, but actually that's important to look at, but think more about the governance of the choices you're making. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to just break for a second and go back. Najma, because I'm inspired by what both of you said. Najma, I want to say, when we go back to, so this very big, I call a jamboree, and that's just because I'm not a cynic, but I just don't see the impact of it, COP. I think it's great that we've got this international agreement, right, that happens. But, this COP was meant to be inspiring, pivotal, change-making because of where we're going. Did you at any point, Najma, and it's not a political question at all, I just want to know, did the notion of a social contract come up in the conversation at COP?
Absolutely. It came up in the spaces that I went to.
Uh-huh.
I attended a fantastic meeting of women leaders. And thank you for mentioning that earlier, Dharmendra, that we're working on a racist feminist social contract. And we discussed many cases and indications where the women's movement was fighting for both social and ecological justice, very much echoing what Alina spoke earlier about the case in Nepal. And no surprise, we were on the margins of the COP discussions. We were not in the main negotiating table, but I did have an opportunity to, with partners such as Transparency International,
Great.
Christian Aid, partners from across the world. We had a fantastic discussion about a new eco-social contract. We launched a people's call for a new social contract at the COP. And I do think what hit me very strongly at the meeting of the Africa-Europe Women's Network meeting was the lack of accountability measures.
Yeah.
And so everyone really loved the idea of a new social contract. That's all about what's missing from the existing social contract is accountability, transparency, integrity, the opportunity for people to participate, the fact that we're completely blind and are, to our dependence upon nature. It surfaced in the term in a few places, but the ideas behind the social contract were definitely there.
Thank you. That point you make is, I think it's a hardwiring across the piece about the accountability thing. Not only about COP, because COP meets, but who is, how are those who are involved in COP, the leaders and others, accountable for what actually happens? But you go down to the local level, and the examples I used about the corruption and fraud most recently, the fact that, the European Commission, well, especially the Parliament, hasn't got that level of accountability and transparency built in. And, if we get some of that right, some of the social contract stuff can be, because political leaders will feel the sense of accountability rather than actually being cozy and comfortable that actually they can get away with it without people looking. And that sense of, being a shareholder of society, how you get citizens and communities feeling their sense of being a shareholder. And I think the route through that is understanding what the tax pays for. And, it's an important relationship that we mustn't lose sight of. So Najma, thank you very much for coming back to us. I'm going to move on to Maureen, who is next energy consumer. Maureen Cornelis, you're an energy consumer expert, and you're kind of working on energy justice issues, etc. I just wanted to get a sense from you, your sense of the debate that you're listening to. And, we had a presentation from previous people about energy justice from colleagues who are working very locally and, moving away from poverty to an energy justice model. What are the implications of what you're doing for a social contract?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to this very high-level panel. Indeed, I think there are really, really valid points that have been made. One being the fact that we are totally overlooking the G in ESG criteria, the sustainability assessment. We forget, we think about environment, but we tend to forget about social and governance issues. But they are fundamental, they are really central. And this governance also means that we need a lot of diversity, not only at the decision-making level of businesses, but also at the policy level. And this morning when I was talking about energy poverty, I was really thinking about this event that I attended the other day, where where the majority of the speakers were men of a certain age. I don't have anything against men of a certain age, but I feel that unless you have proper commitment and proper action to have representation that go beyond the traditional, the traditional gang and the traditional, pardon my French, sausage party, well, you don't really overcome certain obstacles. And another point that I would like to make is really about overcoming the charity and philanthropy aspect when thinking more broadly about energy justice. And why are most of the energy poverty projects only covered as, a department of a company that will be looking at the damage that has been done by certain projects? I mean, it has to be way more central in the way business is done, because we're talking about business, but it's a very particular business, because energy is way more than a commodity. It's something that is absolutely essential for our daily lives. And I mean, in Europe this winter, we are for the first time in 50 years concerned about the security of supply, like having really electricity at home. I mean, I also work in Africa, and for the people out there, I mean, half of the continent doesn't have access to electricity, and the other half has access to bad quality electricity. So there is this. For them, the topic was very prevalent, and now it's moving to Europe, and now we kind of understand a little bit more what is at stake. And policymakers are really concerned about that, but still, how do they listen to the people? How do they anticipate the kind of damage that could happen? For the time being, they don't know anything, and liability is absolutely missing on that part. And why is it missing? It's also because there are no the regulators, for instance, are not acting to fix the market before the problem happens. What happens is that you have a lot of ex post actions that are performed, but not so much ex ante. We are lacking capacity on the consumer side, on the human side. And this is really pretty obvious from the work I do in Brussels. I mean, at the time being, there is only one organization that is really capable of defending consumers. We will have this business go to the table and with policymakers and regulators and the European Commission and say, we need to defend consumers. But of course, defend against whom and against what? But have the narrative that is actually not about consumer being somebody who pays and doesn't have a word to say, but as somebody and billions of people with different interests and ideas and projects in mind. And I'm also very much concerned of how policy is kind of designed with this kind of ideal consumer, which may be a person that is extremely digitally savvy and practical, etc., while 20% of the EU population is already over 65.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the pragmatic response has to involve the people, and we shouldn't be afraid of doing some focus groups, of using the same marketing technique as, I don't know, the toilet paper industry or the yogurt industry to just assess what people want and how ready they are to engage. And utilities, in the energy sector, I can see it. Utilities are kind of terrible at listening to the people, and they don't even make use of the complaints.
Indeed. Marina, thank you very much. You build on the point that Donald made earlier and others have made, is the thing about they've had, I suppose the energy companies have had the highest amount of profit in the shortest period of time in their histories. So that's important to note, both those points, in the past 18 months. And they're quibbling about actually having to have a windfall tax on them. I mean, go figure. It's the point you're making.
May I just add one figure? The Belgian Energy Ombudsman, who's basically a body in charge of fixing the complaints while after they happen, in 2022 received around 27,000 complaints. Usually, in a normal year, they receive 6,000.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Just think about that.
No, exactly. But how do you build on that? Because that's the beauty. I mean, it's great to have that number, but it's what you're saying, that some of us who are involved in community development need to be thinking differently about how you reach and how you engage. And I'm also running out of time, so I'm really sorry, because I know that we've got important stuff also, that's in addition to this important stuff, to move on to. But before I invite and thank you, Maria, for that point, but there is that thing about how do you find a way to greater accountability when you've had energy companies have the highest full profit in the shortest period of time, and not feel in their skin that actually it shouldn't go to my shareholders, but it should go to the community, because actually the community through their taxes have held up society. So, there you go. Any questions from you? Some of you are nodding at me, but I want to know whether you've got questions. Any issues, because you've been quiet. Please, again, please do introduce yourself, and whether it's a question, and can I just ask anyone who wants to come in, no long speeches, that would be great, but directly to the point, that would be lovely.
My name is I'm working at Maastricht Sustainability Institute here at this university. My question is, I hear a lot about the young generation that is showing a lot of leadership and should probably take on more leadership. But I think also that the old generation should also take the responsibility. It should not only be young generation.
Indeed.
So I think that is a very important point to make.
If I may, I'm going to leave that out there, because I think there are people listening to this, and I think you're making a really important point, because usually it's the complaint is that the older lot are not making space and actually making decisions politically because they're more conservative and not taking on board some of this agenda. And actually they have as much responsibility. But you know what's interesting, in the elections that are coming up, how many of you know that 20% of those people who are going to be involved in the European Parliament elections next year are young people, first-time voters, 16-year-olds. 20%. That's huge. That's change-making. And so that we need to kind of really think about in terms of how do you involve those new young people, 20% of the new voters next year, that could actually make a difference on some of this agenda. Any other question or comment you'd like to make? Please, speak up and say who you are and what your question is. You've inspired a reaction straight away.
Well,
Someone hasn't spoken yet.
Yeah, I just wanted to let you know that the youth climate
Say who
movement.
you are, say
Oh,
who you are.
I'm Nikki Tripp, still, for people who were already here this morning. And the youth climate movement, so the EKB, they have a vision document for 2040 that is very clear, very easy, very nice, also like visual, about like 6 or 7 different subjects like food, transport, all that. All those sectors and how that should look like in the future. So if you want an image, that is one of the best images.
Great. I would like to have like full Instagram, full vision of what the future is.
Yeah, and I would always say that if you want to think more about the future and what it should look like, then just get a room of people and also let them close their eyes and try and really go there and think about it and what you want to see around you. And for example, I do this in the financial sector, and I always ask, like, did you think about your bank account? And nobody did. So inside, people do really care about other things than like money, even in the financial sector. But it's just like you need to find a way to get it out of them and then work towards like an actual vision, because that is much easier to work to something towards something that you can actually imagine.
Just for those online, I know that you may not have heard that. It wasn't necessarily a question, but an issue that was raised about, being able to imagine a future that's more hopeful. And actually, when you were speaking, it was like the future feels kind of horrific and not very hopeful. And what we need to do is, for those of us in this room that feel comfortable with the narrative, that actually to engage those who will actually make change happen or feel the sense of ownership of change or actually be catalyzed into change, need to have images and a sense of a future that's more hopeful. And so, if you've got ideas on that, also post it online. But it's a really important point you make, because we feel like we're in Armageddon, don't we? And those of you who are involved in trying to work within the heart of community, one of our colleagues here, I think he's left, one of the councillors said, people are making choices, it was your colleague, between heat or eat. That's a very difficult conversation to have, to say, be hopeful. And so we have to find the tools and devices to actually encourage that. What you were saying is that, how do you make community advocacy and community action something that feels real and that you can believe in, because you feel so hopeless? And actually, what we do know is 10 people in your locality getting together and writing together to the councillor will make a noise and can change things, but we often don't have that sense. Anyone else who wants to make a comment or a point? I'm really happy to take you before we go back to our contributors from the floor. Don't be shy. Any reaction to what you've heard so far? Whether you like it, don't like it, or the issues are for you? Anyone? Go on, great. Speak up and be loud.
My name is Sander. I'm a student here at Maastricht studying sustainability. And I was wondering, because we talk a lot about subsidies and changing that and how we regulate that, but how would we go about that? Because I don't see any political parties here that are part of this discussion. And I feel like that's largely their responsibility to do with us pushing them, of course. But how would we go about that?
Great, really good point. And again, just for those who are online, if you didn't hear that, it's about subsidies. How do you engage political parties and those who are involved in drawing up manifestos? That's my word, not yours. But those thinking about how do you create accountability? And one of those accountabilities are the use of subsidy. And the point that was made by some of our panelists is that actually private sector companies shouldn't get subsidy unless they have a commitment to pay back. And what I'd say to you, and if you're part of any youth coalition, and those who are going to be first-time voters, you could make that a campaign theme, across Europe, to say no to subsidy to the private sector unless there's payback and accountability. But let's build on that. If you've got thoughts online, write that down. But I'm going to move on. But thank you very much for that point. It's a really important point, is to move on to René. René, you've been involved in change making, looking at transition of economies. Briefly from you, give us a reflection on what you've heard and what's missing, or what we should focus on.
Yeah, well, I also have my 4 points, 2 of which are financial, about what we can do. Before saying that, I also want to say that we live in a time in which there's also a prospect of a populist dystopia. And we shouldn't forget about that, and we should also avoid that all, let's say, well-intended policy and initiatives lead us in that direction. That's also what Patrick and I are calling for, a synchronization of different transitions, including the social-economic transitions. But, well, my concrete proposals for change, and then I have to go because I have to, dress differently, is a Tobin tax on financial transactions.
Say that again clearly.
A Tobin tax on financial transactions, so that we would have less of those, because they're not contributing sort of to societal well-being. The second one is to have complementary currencies, let's say local currencies, to make sure that the money is being spent sort of locally, and you could also connect it to a point system for volunteering work. And that there would also be more opportunities for volunteers to do things which are useful for themselves and for others. The third one is that something that Patrick is working on, which is our area-based programs for social, ecological, transformative innovation, such as different types of farming, but then organized on a regional level with some kind of political support, but not with politicians sort of being, in control, because, transformative change, cannot be put under anyone's control. Mm-hmm. And then the fourth and last thing would be well, to create a different economics, which is more about the interaction between economy and society, about issues sort of, what's behind increasing inequality. And, how does exploitation really work? Because you won't find that in a textbook. And also some attention to the perverse links that exist, that, we have cheap products, which are also important for people who are poor. So these are my 4 points.
Thank you very much. I'm being looked at and glared at by every corner of the room saying, you're running out of time, you've got to finish. And I'm really sorry about that. But this is too good. So I'm going to push for another 5 minutes, if I may. And Nikki, I'm not going to let us pass without your intervention. I love the name of shareholders of our future, or shareholders of the future. Tell us a little bit about what's that about, briefly. But what do you think we can do on this agenda?
Yeah. So with Shareholders of the Future, it's an initiative to really empower young people that we have something to say, or we can say something about like capital or like assets, like big money, like institutional investors, because they are making decisions right now that are influencing our future. So we are a stakeholder in that process. Maybe they don't recognize us as a stakeholder, but I'm making us make that they will recognize us as a stakeholder, because we are. And I'm trying to empower more young people to feel like they're an actual stakeholder to be reckoned with. So I think that is very important to, you don't really, young people have a voice. You just need to give them more of a platform. So I'm trying to just get doors to open and get into spaces that are maybe not accessible to us, so we can speak that voice. So I think that is very important. And then also, so to all other generations here, please keep on opening those doors so we can get in and help you and think with you on the long term. And then maybe another point on this agenda is more that what we haven't really mentioned yet is broad GDP. So if you would monitor or report on more capitals than just one, than just the financial, I think it's something we touched upon earlier, then social return is actually worth something. Because right now it's already worth something, but we just don't recognize it as being worthy of something. Or we don't put a number on it, so it's not worthy. You don't see it back on your numbers of a company. But social impact or other human capital, intellectual capital, it is worth something. So if you would be reporting on those capitals right now, we can do more of that, and we can invest more in it, because you can actually see the worth of it. So that is something I would really like to advocate for, and also help investors do this, because I think that if I can quickly link it back to pensions, my favorite topic, then it's such a weird system that you would just give your money to a pension fund for 40, 45, maybe 50 years in my case, and then you get it back with some return, financial return in the end. But in the meantime, it's still my money. I should have a say over it, though right now I don't. And they should be doing good with it and making impact in maybe different ways, so in social or human capital. So it actually is value for me in the whole time that it's there, instead of just having financial return in the end.
Nikki, great. That's fantastic. And, it goes back to your point about subsidy. I think these two are linked, actually, in different ways. It's about how money that's collected on your behalf as a pension fund, you can affect that investment, absolutely. And I know in the UK in particular, I'm not sure about the continent of Europe, there has been a lot of development of shareholder accountability. A number of organisations have really sprouted up and they're almost buying shares in companies and suddenly actually turning the vote or turning up to public meetings of shareholders and actually challenging company executives. Interesting way of doing things. But both your points are really well made. And I will close. I promise I'm going to close very short. But I want to bring back Romani from the OECD very briefly. Just to take from you that, for us, we want to build this renewed social contract, so coalition. And sorry, thank you, René, for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you in a dress in a moment or so. So we want to be able to build a coalition, right, into the future. And I just want to know, is this something that OECD will work on? I'm not asking you to commit publicly, but we need people like you. So part of this change agenda is, how do you find individuals at the heart of networks with social and political capital to help this agenda forward? So I suppose I'm putting you online and asking, Romani, can we count on you to take some of this forward from the OECD perspective?
Yeah, well, thanks. For sure, you can count on the OECD. I think that there were very, very many important points and proposals that were made. I wouldn't say that all of them would necessarily work. And maybe if I can say, I think I've heard a lot of very, very sensible things. And just to sort of quote a couple, I mean, I think the last point about what we do report on capitals and, thinking of stock of wealth and assets beyond sort of the financial one, that, is something we have a big agenda on. We're working with countries on. So definitely it's one that I think is worth sort of, pushing forward together. If I may make just a comment on, perhaps a caveat or the challenges and that perhaps relate a bit to the issues on subsidies and sort of the taxation, which I think are all good ideas. The issue you will find when we discuss these things with different governments is that they may have their own preferences on a number of those issues, right? Yeah. And so to say it in very simple sort of term, you will not necessarily find consensus around defining one social contract. I think it's still the case that we're talking about many social contracts. Yeah. And so at the very first, I think, the conversation, at least let's unify and sort of converge in terms of one social contract within Europe. However, let's also, remind ourselves that it's so that Europe, obviously, economically speaking, is not operating alone. And so whenever you introduce additional taxation, regulation, etc., yes, of course, you're doing it for very good reasons, and I think for social reasons, and for all the good discussions, reasons we discussed today. However, you're also competing economically with many other actors in the world. And so going back to your point about what is the narrative that we have to change is the one sort of consulting companies around, reduce your spending because this is actually not good for your prosperity, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure this is what's, hampering or sort of, blocking the conversation in Europe. It's not so much the narrative. I mean, I can tell you that I work a lot with the Commission, and Commission has very much adopted the new narrative. I think the problem is more sort of, the other countries in the world. And so that I think complexify a bit the issues, but a lot of interesting, I think, proposals today. So we will be happy to follow up with you and how sort of to make some of those sort of perhaps more real.
Excellent. We'll definitely be chapping at your door as a part of this broader coalition. Thank you all. I've just had a gentleman look at me and go like that. So I really need to stop. Okay. So that's a kind of really clear command to me. So thank you, those of you online, for being patient, and hopefully this was thoughtful, provocative, and stimulating, and may make you do stuff and respond to some of the questions. Those of you here in this hallowed context, thank you very much for being with us and being patient. And even though we've been running on, but it has been quite. I hope you think this has been good. We've had some focus on real practical things, and some of you have come up with practical things. But let's build on it, I hope. From our part, as Friends of Europe, you can be assured we'll be taking this forward as part of our work on renewed social contract, and we'll be working with you. Those of you who want to join the party, email us, because we're going to form these 10 social, these policy choices by the autumn, and we really welcome your thinking on it. And I think the young vote, I think you, Nikki, and others need to connect. 20% of that vote next year. 20%, that's game changing. And if some of those young people can mount a campaign about subsidy, accountability, wow, we could look for a more hopeful future. Thank you all. Thank you, our panelists here and online. And take care. Thank you very much.